In the heart of a small Texas town where legends were born and stories were told over cold beer and country music, sat the Lone Star Saloon. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered wood, neon signs that had seen better days, and a parking lot filled with pickup trucks and motorcycles. But for the locals, it was a sanctuary, a place where the day's troubles melted away with each sip of their favorite drink. Behind the bar stood Mike Reynolds, the newest addition to the Lone Star family. At 32, Mike was what most would call a man with a chip on his shoulder. Life hadn't dealt him the cards he thought he deserved, and it showed in the hard lines of his face and the barely contained anger that simmered beneath his surface. He'd bounced from job to job across 3 states, never staying in one place long enough for people to get to know the real Mike, the one who dreamed of something bigger than mixing drinks and wiping down countertops. "Another round for the boys in the corner," called out Darlene, the veteran waitress who had seen bartenders come and go over her 15 years at the Lone Star. She gave Mike a cautious smile as she approached the bar. Mike had been working at the Lone Star for just 3 weeks, and already his reputation for a short fuse had spread among the staff. "They don't need another round," Mike muttered, glancing at the group of men laughing and telling stories in the corner booth. "Look at 'em, already 3 sheets to the wind." "It's not our job to parent grown men, Mike," Darlene replied softly. "It's our job to serve drinks and make sure everyone has a good time." Mike slammed down the bottles he was holding, causing several nearby patrons to jump. "Fine, whatever. Another round coming up." As Mike aggressively mixed the drinks, the door to the Lone Star swung open, letting in a gust of warm Texas air. In walked a man who, at first glance, seemed entirely ordinary. Average height, trim build, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes alert but kind. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, except for the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from his very being. This was Chuck Norris, though few would immediately recognize him without the context of a movie set or a martial arts demonstration. Today, he was just a man looking for a quiet drink after spending the afternoon at a charity event for local veterans. He had slipped away before the cameras arrived, preferring to make his contribution without the fanfare that usually followed him. Chuck took a seat at the far end of the bar, nodding politely to the woman seated next to him. He didn't need to announce who he was or demand special treatment. That wasn't his style. He had learned long ago that true respect wasn't commanded, it was earned. Mike noticed the new arrival and made his way over, tossing a cocktail napkin on the bar with little care for where it landed. "What'll it be?" he asked, not bothering to make eye contact. "Just a mineral water with lime, please," Chuck replied, his voice carrying the distinctive Texas drawl that had become familiar to millions through his films and television shows. Mike scoffed slightly. "Mineral water? Bar's for drinking, buddy. Kitchen's closed, so if you're just here for water, might want to try the gas station down the road." A couple of patrons nearby exchanged glances. One of them, an older man named Frank, who had been coming to the Lone Star since before Mike was born, leaned forward slightly. He had recognized Chuck immediately, but said nothing. Sometimes it was better to let things unfold naturally. "The water will be fine, thank you," Chuck responded, unfazed by Mike's attitude. He had encountered all types in his 70-plus years of life. A grumpy bartender wasn't even a blip on his radar of challenges faced. Mike shrugged and grabbed a bottle of mineral water from the cooler, popping the cap off with unnecessary force before sliding it across the bar. He forgot the lime entirely, either out of spite or simple carelessness. Chuck caught the bottle smoothly before it could slide off the bar. "Thank you," he said, still maintaining his polite demeanor. He didn't mention the missing lime. Mike had already turned his attention elsewhere, moving to serve other customers who were ordering real drinks, as he would later describe it to his coworker. Little did Mike know, his dismissive treatment of the unassuming man at the end of the bar was being noticed not just by Chuck, but by several patrons who recognized the martial arts legend and actor. As the evening progressed, the Lone Star began to fill with the usual Friday night crowd, locals stopping by after work, couples on dates, and groups of friends gathering to start their weekend right. The jukebox played a mix of classic country and southern rock, creating the perfect backdrop for the unfolding drama that no one yet realized was brewing. Chuck sat quietly, occasionally checking his phone and responding to texts from his wife, who was wondering when he'd be home. He was in no rush. Despite Mike's less than stellar service, Chuck was enjoying the atmosphere of the Lone Star, a genuine Texas bar with genuine Texas people. Places like this reminded him of his humble beginnings and kept him grounded despite his success. Meanwhile, Mike continued his shift with the same aggressive energy he'd started with. He slammed glasses down, barked orders at Darlene and the other waitstaff, and made little effort to hide his irritation with customers who ordered complicated drinks or asked too many questions about the menu. "Hey, take it easy on the glassware," said Tom, the owner of the Lone Star, who had emerged from his office to check on the Friday night rush. "Those don't grow on trees, you know." "Maybe if you bought decent glasses instead of this cheap crap, they wouldn't break so easily," Mike retorted, just loud enough for Tom to hear, but not so loud that the customers could make out his words. Tom's face hardened, but he said nothing. Good bartenders were hard to find in a town this size, and despite Mike's attitude, he made drinks quickly and accurately. For now, Tom was willing to tolerate some attitude in exchange for efficiency, but his patience was wearing thin. Chuck observed this exchange with interest. He had met many men like Mike over the years, men who confused aggression for strength, who believed that kindness was weakness. In his younger days, Chuck might have been tempted to teach such men a lesson in humility through his fists, but age and wisdom had taught him that true change rarely came through force. As the night wore on, more patrons began to recognize Chuck. Whispers spread through the bar, and several people approached him for autographs or photos. Chuck obliged each one with a smile and a few kind words, never once acting as though their requests were an imposition. Mike watched these interactions with growing confusion and irritation. Who was this guy? And why were so many people making such a fuss over him? In Mike's mind, the only people worthy of such attention were those who flaunted their wealth or status, and this guy in the simple button-down didn't fit either category. Little did Mike know that the unassuming man at his bar had fought his way to worldwide fame through talent, hard work, and an unwavering moral compass. Chuck Norris hadn't been handed anything in life. He had earned every bit of his success through discipline and perseverance, qualities that Mike, for all his bluster, had yet to develop. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of both men's lives, one that would teach Mike a lesson no amount of traditional education could provide, a lesson about judging books by their covers, about respect, and about the quiet power of humility in a world that too often rewards the loudest voice rather than the wisest one. And it all began with a simple mistake on a bar tab that was about to be delivered. The Lone Star Saloon was now in full swing, with the clinking of glasses providing a steady rhythm beneath the country music and laughter. Chuck had been sitting quietly at the bar for over an hour, occasionally exchanging pleasantries with other patrons who recognized him, but mostly keeping to himself. He had ordered a simple club sandwich along with his mineral water, one of the few food options available at the bar after the kitchen had officially closed. Mike slid a piece of paper across the bar toward Chuck. "Your tab," he said curtly, already turning away to serve another customer. Chuck glanced down at the bill, his brow furrowing slightly as he reviewed the charges. With the same calm demeanor that had defined his public persona for decades, he raised his hand to get Mike's attention. "Excuse me," Chuck said, his voice even and respectful. "I think there might be a mistake on my bill." Mike turned back, making no effort to hide his annoyance. "What's the problem now?" he asked, emphasizing the now as if Chuck had been complaining all evening. "I was charged for 2 sandwiches and a whiskey neat, but I only ordered 1 sandwich and mineral water," Chuck explained, sliding the bill back toward Mike. Mike snatched the paper, scanning it quickly with narrowed eyes. "Kitchen says they made you 2 sandwiches, and someone ordered this whiskey," he insisted, pointing to the item on the bill. Frank, the older patron who had recognized Chuck earlier, leaned over from his seat nearby. "Mike, that was my whiskey. I'm at the other end of the bar, and I only saw Mr. Norris here get 1 sandwich." Mike's head snapped toward Frank. "Mr. Norris? Who the hell is—" His voice trailed off as realization slowly dawned on his face, followed quickly by dismissal. "Whatever, I'll fix the bill, but the kitchen's backed up because of special orders after closing. he added pointedly, glaring at Chuck. Chuck simply nodded, still unperturbed by Mike's attitude. No rush, thank you. As Mike stomped off to adjust the bill, a couple seated near Chuck turned toward him. Are you really Chuck Norris? The woman asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Yes, ma'am, Chuck replied with a humble smile. I told you it was him, she said to her companion. We're huge fans of Walker, Texas Ranger. Would you mind if we got a quick photo? Not at all, Chuck said, standing to pose with the couple as they took a selfie. Mike watched this interaction from behind the bar, his irritation growing by the second. In his mind, this guy was disrupting his bar, getting special treatment from the kitchen, and now causing a scene with the other customers. The fact that people seemed impressed by him only fueled Mike's resentment. Hey, Mike, called Darlene in a hushed tone as she approached the bar. Do you know who that is? That's Chuck Norris, the Chuck Norris. Yeah, I heard, Mike replied dismissively. Some washed-up actor or something. Darlene's jaw dropped. Washed up? He's a legend. Multiple black belts, undefeated middleweight karate champion for 6 years straight, and one of the most respected martial artists in the world, not to mention all his movies and TV shows. If he's such a big shot, what's he doing in our dump of a bar? Mike scoffed, mixing a margarita with aggressive movements that sent tequila sloshing over the rim of the glass. Being a normal person? Enjoying a quiet night out? Darlene suggested, her tone making it clear she thought the answer was obvious. Just be nice, okay? He's actually really important in these parts. Mike rolled his eyes and finished preparing the adjusted bill. He slapped it down in front of Chuck, who was now surrounded by a small group of admirers, sharing stories and asking for autographs. Your new bill, Mike announced loudly, deliberately interrupting the conversation. Chuck politely excused himself from his fans and turned his attention to the bill. Thank you, he said, reviewing the new charges. His brow furrowed once more. I'm sorry, but this still doesn't seem right. I wasn't charged for the mineral water, but there's an extra charge here for loaded nachos that I didn't order. Mike's face flushed with anger. Are you serious right now? I fixed your precious bill, and you're still complaining? The bar began to quiet as patrons turned to watch the escalating tension. Chuck remained calm, his voice level. I'm not complaining, just pointing out another error. I'd be happy to pay for my actual order. Look, Mr. Big Shot, Mike said, leaning across the bar until his face was uncomfortably close to Chuck's. I don't care who you think you are. In this bar, I'm in charge of the bills, and if I say you ordered nachos, then you ordered nachos. Tom, the owner, emerged from the back room, immediately sensing the tension. What's going on out here? He asked, his eyes darting between Mike and the increasingly uncomfortable patrons. Nothing, Mike muttered, just a customer being difficult about his bill. Frank stood up from his seat, his loyalty to the Lone Star and his respect for Chuck compelling him to speak. That's not what's happening, Tom. Mike's been rude to Mr. Norris all evening, and now he's trying to overcharge him. Tom's eyebrows shot up as he realized who was sitting at his bar. Chuck Norris? Sir, it's an honor to have you at the Lone Star. I apologize for any misunderstanding. No apology necessary, Chuck assured him. Just a simple billing error. Mike slammed a glass down on the bar top. There's no error. He's just being cheap, famous or not. Several patrons gasped at Mike's outburst. Tom's face hardened. Mike, that's enough. Fix the bill properly and apologize to Mr. Norris. Apologize? For what? Doing my job? Mike's voice was rising now, his hands gripping the edge of the bar so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Everyone's acting like we should roll out the red carpet just because some has-been celebrity decided to grace us with his presence. The bar fell completely silent. Even the jukebox seemed to pause at exactly the wrong moment, leaving Mike's words hanging in the air, harsh and unmistakable. Chuck's expression didn't change, but several of the patrons looked mortified. Mike, Tom warned, his voice dangerously quiet. One more word and you're fired. Mike glared at his boss, then at Chuck, then back at his boss. Without another word, he snatched up the bill, crumpled it in his fist, and stormed off to the register to create a new one. The tension in his shoulders and the barely contained fury in his movements suggested that this was far from over. As conversation slowly resumed in the bar, Chuck turned to Tom. "Please don't be too hard on him. Everyone has bad days." Tom shook his head in disbelief. "You're a better man than most, Mr. Norris. Mike's had too many bad days since he started here, if you ask me." Chuck watched as Mike aggressively punched numbers into the register. There was something familiar about the young man's anger, something that reminded Chuck of himself in his younger years, before he had found discipline through martial arts and spiritual practice. Back when he was just Carlos Ray Norris, a shy, unremarkable kid from rural Oklahoma with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove to the world. Little did either man know that their evening was about to reach a breaking point, one that would test Chuck's legendary patience and Mike's already fragile self-control. And in the crucible of that confrontation, a lesson would be taught that no one in the Lone Star Saloon would soon forget. The atmosphere in the Lone Star Saloon had transformed. What began as a typical Friday night had evolved into something electric, a tension you could almost touch. Patrons whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the fuming bartender and the composed martial arts legend sitting at the bar. Those who had recognized Chuck Norris were now explaining his significance to those who hadn't, creating a ripple effect of awe throughout the establishment. Mike returned with a new bill, practically throwing it in front of Chuck. The total had been adjusted, but Mike's attitude certainly hadn't improved. His jaw was tight, his movements jerky with barely contained rage. "There," he spat. "Happy now?" Chuck glanced at the bill and nodded, reaching for his wallet. "Thank you. This looks correct." He placed his credit card on top of the bill and slid it back toward Mike. Mike snatched it up and stomped back to the register, muttering under his breath about entitled celebrities and special treatment. As he ran the card, he continued his tirade, just loud enough for nearby customers to hear, but not quite loud enough to reach Chuck's ears. "Problem is," Mike was saying to no one in particular, "these celebrities think the world revolves around them. Come into a place like this, act all humble, but really they're just looking for attention." Darlene shot him a warning glance as she picked up her drink orders. "Mike, seriously, let it go," she whispered urgently. Mike ignored her, his voice getting slightly louder. "I mean, who does he think he is? So he kicked a few people in some B-movies 20 years ago. Big deal." Frank, who had remained at his spot observing the situation, shook his head sadly. "Son, you have no idea what you're talking about. That man is a genuine American hero. Show some respect." "I don't need to show respect to anyone who comes into my bar and starts making demands," Mike retorted, completely overlooking the fact that it wasn't his bar and Chuck hadn't made any demands. The credit card machine beeped, and Mike yanked the receipt free, scribbling Chuck's copy with such force that the pen tore through the paper in places. He marched back to Chuck and slammed both the card and mangled receipt in front of him. "Sign it," he ordered, as if commanding a dog to sit. Chuck looked up at Mike, his eyes calm but penetrating. For the first time that evening, the bartender got a full dose of the intensity that had made Chuck Norris such a compelling screen presence for decades. It was not aggression in those eyes, but rather a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself because it's been tested countless times before. "Thank you," Chuck said simply, signing the receipt and adding a generous tip despite Mike's behavior. He stood up, leaving the signed copy on the bar. "You have a good night now." Something about Chuck's dignified response pushed Mike over the edge. Perhaps it was the gracious tip, which felt like charity to his wounded pride. Perhaps it was the realization that, despite his best efforts, he hadn't managed to rattle the older man's composure. Whatever the reason, Mike made a decision that would change the course of his life. "Wait just a minute," Mike called out as Chuck began to move toward the door, stopping to say goodbye to some of the patrons he'd chatted with earlier. "You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" The bar fell silent once more. Chuck turned back to face the bartender, his expression questioning but not hostile. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Mike continued, coming out from behind the bar, his body language aggressive as he walked toward Chuck. "Coming in here, acting all high and mighty, making me look bad in front of everyone because of a stupid bill." Tom stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Mike, that's enough. Get back behind the bar right now or you're fired." But Mike was beyond listening to reason. Weeks of pent-up frustration, years of perceived slights and failures, a lifetime of feeling less than. It all converged in this moment, focusing on the man standing calmly before him. In Mike's distorted perception, Chuck represented everything he resented. Success, respect, admiration, all the things Mike felt he deserved, but had never received. "You know what? I don't need this job," Mike snarled, turning briefly to Tom before refocusing on Chuck. "And I don't need some washed-up action star coming into my bar and making a fool out of me." With that, Mike lunged forward, his hand reaching for Chuck's collar, intent on physically removing him from the establishment. It was a move he had performed dozens of times in other bars, on other troublemakers, or at least those he perceived as troublemakers. But Chuck Norris was unlike anyone Mike had ever confronted before. In a motion so fluid it seemed almost casual, Chuck sidestepped the lunge, simultaneously catching Mike's outstretched arm at the wrist. With minimal movement and seemingly no effort at all, he redirected Mike's momentum, using a simple wrist lock to control the younger man. Mike found himself suddenly off balance, his arm immobilized in a hold that caused no pain, but rendered him completely helpless. The entire exchange happened so quickly that many patrons weren't sure what they had just witnessed. One moment, Mike was charging forward, full of rage and intent. The next, he was frozen in place, controlled by Chuck's grip with the precision of a master craftsman handling a delicate tool. "Easy now, son," Chuck said quietly, his voice calm and without a trace of anger. "Let's not do something we'll both regret." Mike struggled briefly against the hold, but each movement only emphasized how completely he was controlled. Chuck had applied just enough pressure to immobilize him without causing injury, a testament to his decades of martial arts mastery and his philosophy of using only the force necessary, never excess. The bar was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the tableau before them. Mike's face transitioned from rage to shock as the reality of his situation became clear. He had just attempted to physically assault Chuck Norris, a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of combat, who had trained special forces soldiers, who had earned legitimate black belts in multiple martial arts disciplines. The absurdity of it hit Mike like a bucket of cold water. "Do you want to calm down now?" Chuck asked, still maintaining the hold but ready to release it at the first sign of compliance. Mike nodded, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had erupted. "Yes," he managed to say, his voice barely audible. Chuck immediately released his grip, stepping back to give Mike space. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at having subdued the younger man. If anything, there was a hint of compassion in his eyes, the look of someone who recognized pain when he saw it. The bar remained silent for several heartbeats before Tom broke the spell. "Mike, you're fired. Get your things and get out." Mike stood rooted to the spot, his brain still struggling to process what had just happened. The rush of adrenaline had subsided, leaving him hollow and slightly nauseous. He looked around at the faces staring back at him, some angry, some pitying, some simply stunned, and realized just how badly he had miscalculated. But it was Chuck's face that finally penetrated Mike's fog of confusion. There was no judgment there, no righteous anger, not even disappointment. Instead, Chuck looked at Mike with understanding, as if he could see beneath the surface aggression to the insecurity that fueled it. In that moment, standing in the middle of a Texas bar, having just made perhaps the most foolish decision of his life, Mike Reynolds had a realization. He had become exactly the kind of person he claimed to despise, entitled, disrespectful, and completely blind to his own flaws. And somehow, the man he had just tried to assault seemed to understand this better than he did himself. The Lone Star Saloon remained eerily quiet in the wake of the confrontation. Patrons exchanged glances, unsure whether to resume their conversations or continue watching the drama unfold before them. Tom stood with his arms crossed, waiting for Mike to collect his things and leave as instructed. Mike himself seemed frozen in place, the full weight of his actions beginning to settle on his shoulders. It was Chuck who broke the uncomfortable silence. "Tom," he said, turning to the bar owner, "would you mind if I had a word with Mike before he goes?" Tom's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You want to talk to him, after what just happened?" Chuck nodded. "Just for a few minutes. In private, if that's possible." Tom hesitated, then gestured toward a small office at the back of the bar. You can use my office, but I don't know what good it'll do. This isn't his first incident, just the worst one. Thank you, Chuck replied, then turned to Mike. Would you join me for a moment? Mike looked as surprised as everyone else, but he nodded slowly. What choice did he have? He'd already lost his job and made a complete fool of himself in front of the entire bar. Following Chuck to the office was the least humiliating option available to him. As the two men made their way to the back, conversation gradually resumed in the bar, though the incident remained the primary topic of discussion. Darlene began clearing Chuck's spot at the bar, shaking her head in disbelief at the evening's unexpected turn of events. Inside the small, cluttered office, Chuck took a seat in one of the two chairs facing Tom's desk, gesturing for Mike to take the other. Mike sat down heavily, his posture deflated, eyes fixed on the floor. For several seconds, neither man spoke. I'm sorry, Mike finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what came over me. Chuck studied the younger man thoughtfully. I think you do know, he replied, his tone free of accusation. That kind of anger doesn't come from nowhere. Mike looked up, surprised by the response. He had expected a lecture, perhaps even threats of legal action. Instead, Chuck's words seemed like an invitation to reflect. I've been angry for a long time, Mike admitted after a moment. Nothing ever seems to go right for me. Every time I think I'm getting ahead, something happens to knock me back down. Chuck nodded. I understand that feeling better than you might think. Did you know I was 34 years old before I landed my first movie role? Mike looked at him with surprise. Really? But you're, Chuck Norris. A small smile crossed Chuck's face. I wasn't always. Once upon a time, I was just Carlos Ray Norris, a shy kid from rural Oklahoma with a drunk father and not much hope for the future. I joined the Air Force because I didn't have many other options. I didn't know that, Mike said quietly. Most people don't, Chuck continued. They see the end result, not the struggle it took to get there. When I started competing in martial arts tournaments, I lost my first 3. Got beaten pretty badly too, but each loss taught me something valuable. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but our situations are different. You obviously had talent. I'm nobody special. That's where you're wrong, Chuck said firmly. Everyone has potential. The difference is what you do with it. I could have given up after those first defeats. Instead, I trained harder. I focused on improving myself rather than blaming others or circumstances. For the first time that evening, Mike really looked at Chuck, not as a celebrity or a threat to his ego, but as someone who might actually understand his struggles. How did you do it? How did you stop being angry all the time? Chuck leaned forward slightly. I realized that anger is a secondary emotion. It usually masks something deeper. Fear, shame, disappointment. For me, it was fear of never amounting to anything, of being just like my father. Once I understood that, I could address the real issue. For me, it's... Mike paused, struggling to articulate feelings he had never fully examined. I guess it's feeling like I deserve better than what life has given me. Like everyone else got a head start somehow. That's a heavy burden to carry, Chuck observed, and a false one. No one is entitled to success or respect. Those things are earned through actions and character. The good news is, that means they're within your control. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Tom poked his head in, his expression still stern. Everything okay in here? Before Mike could speak, Chuck responded, We're having a good talk. Tom, I'd like to make a suggestion, if I may. Instead of firing Mike outright, would you consider giving him one last chance? Under certain conditions, of course. Tom's jaw nearly dropped. You can't be serious, after what he did? I am serious, Chuck affirmed. Everyone deserves an opportunity to learn from their mistakes. I'm willing to forget about tonight's incident if Mike agrees to work on his anger issues, maybe attend some counseling sessions. Mike looked between the two men, astonished. Why would you do that for me? I've been nothing but disrespectful to you all night. Chuck turned back to Mike. Because 40 years ago, someone gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. Sometimes that's all a person needs to change their path. Tom ran a hand through his thinning hair, clearly conflicted. I don't know, Chuck. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've got a business to run. I can't have my bartenders attacking customers, no matter what lessons they might learn from it. I understand completely, Chuck nodded, and the decision is yours to make. I'm just offering my perspective. Mike stood up suddenly. Wait, before you decide anything, Tom, I need to say something. He turned to face both men, his expression sincere for perhaps the first time that evening. I've been a terrible employee, not just tonight, but since you hired me. I've taken my problems out on everyone around me. You, the staff, the customers. You don't owe me another chance. Tom looked surprised at this admission. But, Mike continued, if you're willing to give me one, I promise things will be different. No more attitude, no more taking my frustrations out on others. I'll get help for my anger issues, and I'll actually start appreciating this job instead of treating it like it's beneath me. The room fell silent as Tom considered Mike's words. After what seemed like an eternity, he sighed deeply. One chance. That's it. One more incident, even a small one, and you're done. No discussions, no appeals. Are we clear? Relief washed over Mike's face. Crystal clear. Thank you, Tom. I won't let you down. Don't thank me, Tom replied, gesturing toward Chuck. Thank the man you tried to throw out of my bar. If it were solely up to me, you'd be updating your resume right now. Mike turned to Chuck, struggling to find adequate words. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Actions speak louder than words, Chuck replied, standing up and extending his hand to Mike. Show your gratitude by making the most of this opportunity. Mike shook Chuck's hand firmly, a newfound respect evident in his eyes. I will. I promise. As the three men emerged from the office, the bar's patrons watched curiously. Many had expected to see Mike leaving in disgrace. Instead, he walked alongside Chuck Norris, their conversation continuing as if they were old friends rather than near combatants from just minutes earlier. Frank raised his glass slightly as they passed. Everything worked out? He asked. Chuck nodded. We came to an understanding. Mike looked around at the faces watching him, some curious, some still wary. He had spent weeks alienating these people with his attitude, creating a reputation as someone to be avoided rather than engaged. Changing that perception wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time, he felt motivated to try. I should get back to work, Mike said, gesturing toward the bar where Darlene was struggling to keep up with the orders that had accumulated during his absence. Chuck placed a hand on Mike's shoulder. Remember what we talked about. Self-discipline isn't just about controlling your actions. It's about mastering your thoughts and emotions too. That's where true strength comes from. Mike nodded, absorbing the wisdom from a man who had lived by these principles for decades. I'll remember. And Mr. Norris, I really am sorry about everything tonight. Call me Chuck, he replied with a smile, and sometimes the best things in life come from our worst moments. This could be a turning point for you if you let it be. As Mike returned to his position behind the bar, offering a genuine apology to Darlene for leaving her swamped with orders, Chuck prepared to depart. Several patrons approached to shake his hand or request a photo, which he obliged with characteristic humility. But his eyes occasionally drifted to Mike, watching as the young bartender began the difficult work of redemption. One drink order, one polite interaction, one moment of self-control at a time. 6 months had passed since that fateful night at the Lone Star Saloon. The Texas summer had given way to fall, and fall had melted into winter before yielding to the first promising buds of spring. The bar itself looked much the same. Same weathered exterior, same neon signs, same mixture of regulars and newcomers seeking cold drinks and warm company. But something significant had changed within its walls, and that something was Mike Reynolds. Here you go, ma'am. 1 mojito, extra mint, just how you like it, Mike said, sliding the perfectly crafted drink across the bar to Mrs. Henderson, a retired school teacher who had become a regular on Thursday evenings. And how's your grandson doing at college? Still studying engineering? Mrs. Henderson beamed at him. He is, made the dean's list last semester. I'm so proud I could burst. As you should be, Mike replied with a genuine smile. Next time he's in town, his first drink is on me. This was the new Mike, attentive, friendly, and genuinely interested in his customers' lives. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been struggles, moments of backsliding, days when the old anger threatened to resurface. But through it all, Mike had kept his promise, both to Tom and to himself. You know, Darlene commented as she collected a tray of drinks for a corner table. I never thought I'd say this, but you're actually the best bartender we've ever had here. Mike chuckled. Only took a confrontation with Chuck Norris to get me there. Not exactly the career path they teach you in bartending school. Whatever works, Darlene replied with a wink before whisking away the drinks. True to his word, Mike had sought help for his anger issues. Twice a week, he attended counseling sessions with a therapist who specialized in anger management. He'd learned to recognize his triggers, to understand the root causes of his rage, and most importantly, to develop healthier responses to frustration and disappointment. But perhaps the most significant change had come from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the incident, with Tom's blessing, Mike had enrolled in classes at the local martial arts studio. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. His first instinct had been to avoid anything that reminded him of that humiliating night. But something Chuck had said about finding discipline through martial arts had stuck with him, nagging at his thoughts until he finally decided to give it a try. Now, 5 months into his training, Mike had earned his yellow belt in karate. More importantly, he had found something that Chuck had discovered decades earlier, that the true value of martial arts lay not in learning to fight, but in learning self-control, respect, and humility. Mike's instructor, Master Lee, emphasized that the strongest person in any room was the one who could walk away from a fight, who used their skills for protection rather than aggression. "Hey, Mike," Tom called from the end of the bar, "can you handle things for a bit?" "I need to meet with the liquor distributor in the back." "No problem, boss," Mike replied confidently. "I've got everything under control." Tom nodded and headed toward his office, pausing briefly to observe the bar. Friday nights were their busiest, and once upon a time, he would have hesitated to leave Mike in charge during peak hours. Now, he did so without a second thought. The change in his bartender had been remarkable, so much so that Tom had recently promoted Mike to assistant manager with a raise to match his new responsibilities. As the evening progressed, the Lone Star filled with its usual weekend crowd. Mike moved efficiently behind the bar, mixing drinks with skill and precision, while maintaining friendly conversation with the patrons. He had learned all the regulars' names and drink preferences, often having their orders ready before they even asked. For newcomers, he offered recommendations and welcomed them warmly, helping to create the kind of atmosphere that turned first-time visitors into loyal customers. "Excuse me," a familiar voice said from the entrance, causing Mike to look up from the whiskey he was pouring. "Is there room for one more?" Mike's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man standing in the doorway. Chuck Norris, dressed in the same simple style as before, jeans and a button-down shirt, was surveying the bar with a subtle smile. "Chuck," Mike called out, unable to contain his surprise and delight. "Of course there's room. Come on in." Several patrons turned at the mention of the name, whispers of recognition spreading through the bar. But there was no tension this time, no impending confrontation, only the pleasant buzz of excitement at a celebrity sighting. Chuck made his way to the bar, nodding politely to those who greeted him along the way. He took a seat directly in front of Mike, his eyes taking in the changes in the young man's demeanor and appearance. Mike stood straighter now, his movements more deliberate and controlled, his expression open rather than guarded. "Mineral water with lime?" Mike asked, already reaching for a bottle. Chuck smiled. "You remembered." "Some customers you don't forget," Mike replied, preparing the drink with care. As he set it down, he added, "especially ones who change your life." Chuck took a sip of his water. "I didn't change your life, Mike. You did that yourself. I just provided a wake-up call." "A pretty effective one," Mike laughed. "But seriously, I've been hoping you'd come back someday so I could thank you properly, not just for convincing Tom to give me another chance, but for what you said to me afterward. About anger being a secondary emotion, about earning respect rather than demanding it. Those words, they stuck with me." I'm glad to hear it, Chuck replied sincerely. But words only matter if they inspire action. From what I can see, you've taken plenty of action since then. Mike nodded. I started counseling for my anger issues, and I've been taking martial arts classes too. Nothing as advanced as what you do, obviously, but it's been transformative. It tends to be, Chuck agreed. The physical training is just the beginning. The mental and spiritual discipline, that's where the real growth happens. As they continued to talk, the bar around them operated smoothly. Customers came and went, ordered drinks, shared stories and laughter. Mike attended to other patrons as needed, never letting his conversation with Chuck interfere with his duties. It was a stark contrast to his behavior 6 months earlier, when he had resentfully served customers while nursing his grievances. You know, Chuck observed, after watching Mike work for a while, martial arts teaches us that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself. Looks like you're doing pretty well with that lesson. Mike's face flushed slightly at the praise. I'm trying. Some days are harder than others, but I haven't lost my temper once since that night. Everyone faces setbacks, Chuck said. The key is to treat them as lessons, not failures. Mike nodded thoughtfully. My instructor says something similar. He tells us that in martial arts, you learn more from getting thrown to the mat than from throwing someone else. Your instructor sounds wise, Chuck smiled. What style are you learning? Karate, primarily. I'm only a yellow belt so far, but I'm dedicated to it. Actually, the discipline has helped me in other areas of my life too. I've started taking night classes at the community college, business management. Tom's been flexible with my schedule so I can attend. Chuck's eyes reflected genuine approval. That's excellent, Mike. Education opens doors. Their conversation continued as the evening wore on, touching on Mike's progress, Chuck's recent charity work, and their shared interest in martial arts philosophy. What struck Mike most was how normal it felt. Two men having a conversation about life, sharing insights and experiences. The gulf that had seemed so vast between them 6 months ago had narrowed considerably, not because Chuck had changed, but because Mike had evolved. As closing time approached, Chuck prepared to leave. I should get going. It's been good seeing you, Mike. Really good. Will you stop by again sometime? Mike asked as he cleared Chuck's glass. I think I might, Chuck replied with a smile. It's not every day you find a place with such excellent service. Mike laughed, then grew serious. Thank you for everything. I know I said it before, but I need to say it again. You could have pressed charges that night, or at least let me get fired. Instead, you saw something in me worth saving. I don't think I'll ever forget that. Chuck extended his hand across the bar. Sometimes, the people who seem the most lost are the ones most ready to be found. You just needed a push in the right direction. As they shook hands, Mike felt a sense of completion, not an ending, but the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The angry young man who had lashed out at the world was gone, replaced by someone with purpose, discipline, and a genuine desire to grow. After Chuck departed, Mike finished closing the bar, wiping down surfaces and restocking for the next day. As he turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, he paused to look up at the stars, visible in the clear Texas sky. 6 months ago, he had been spiraling downward, consumed by resentment and self-pity. Now, he was on an upward trajectory, with education, career advancement, and personal growth all within his grasp. And it had all started with the night he made what could have been the worst mistake of his life, attacking Chuck Norris, only to have it become the catalyst for the best decision he'd ever made, the decision to change.